The Nile, the world's longest river. A 7,000-kilometer lifeline for almost 400 million people. Flowing north, the Nile runs through 10 countries, from the highlands in the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A source of sustenance, but also one of tension, even potential conflict. These tensions between countries along the River Nile have their roots in the 19th century. Colonial decisions of the past are a point of bitter dispute today. And new political realities on the ground are increasing the sense of uncertainty over who owns the River Nile. In September 2005, a team of explorers set off on a unique journey up the Nile River.
We're floating in the Mediterranean Sea at the mouth of the Nile. We're about to begin the longest river journey in the world.
Led by New Zealand adventurer Cam Macleay, the team aimed at being the first expedition to travel up the Nile to its furthest source. The first stage of the trek through Egypt and northern Sudan proved a breeze. But then the explorers encountered the Sud, the world's largest swamp.
And in southern Sudan, it goes into this massive swamp area. It's 1,000 kilometres long and 300 kilometres wide. There's no hills, there's no trees, there's just bird life and water. It's absolutely incredible.
The Sud means obstacle in Arabic, and it has proved just that. A labyrinth of waterways that has hindered past expeditions up the Nile. Macleay's team managed to navigate their way out of the swamp. After 90 days of travel, overcoming tremendous obstacles, they eventually arrived in Rwanda. At a tiny spring which they determined to be the southernmost source of the Nile.
Yeah. Thank you.
Today, Macleay is settled in Uganda, where he runs a whitewater rafting business in the city of Jinja, here on the Nile.
So when you put on your life jacket, it's good. It might not fit you to the people. 1, 2, 3.
Just a few kilometers away from Macleay's business stands this obelisk, a monument to a past Nile adventurer, John Hanning Speke. Speke was a British explorer who arrived here almost 150 years earlier in 1862. He came in search of the answer to an age-old question: where is the source of the Nile? The Royal Geographical Society in London was established in 1830. It houses the maps, navigation tools, and personal belongings of famous explorers from the 19th century. Men who were in the grip of a romantic obsession to discover the source of the Nile.
For Europeans, the exploration of the Nile is probably the biggest goal. drives their enterprise in the 19th century, because it's seen as the largest and the most important river, and also because there is this long heritage or history associated with it.
Rather than trying to cross the Sud area in southern Sudan, explorers in the mid-1800s chose another passage via the island of Zanzibar. During the 19th century, Zanzibar was an Arab kingdom, controlling the trade route from India into Africa's interior.
These Arab traders facilitate European exploration. It's the Arab traders, for example, who begin first to report that there are Great Lakes or a Great Lake in the interior of East Africa.
Based on this information, the Royal Geographical Society sponsored expeditions into the heart of Africa. In 1857, using Zanzibar as a starting point, John Hanning Speke crossed to East Africa and ventured into the hinterland, where he found a huge lake he believed to be the source of the Nile. 3 years later, on a new expedition, he traveled around this lake, today known as Lake Victoria, to discover the Nile flowing out from its northern side. A roll call of famous explorers ventured into the continent's interior to build on Speke's discovery. Men such as Samuel Baker, David Livingstone, and Henry Morton Stanley helped complete the picture about the true source of the Nile. Back home, they were lauded as heroes, with monuments built to honor them. But others saw them differently.
It was mistakenly called discovering. In most books in the past, they used to say Speke discovered the Nile, as if he was the first human being to see the Nile, when actually he was the first European to see the source of the Nile, but not to discover it, because he was even shown the source of the Nile by the Africans here.
The Royal Geographical Society helped push the boundaries of exploration and empire. But this age of exploration is seen by many as the precursor of colonization.
Most of these people were explorers, but intelligence services in their own countries made use of their experiences. They were not only British, but also Belgians and French. They observed the people and the situation in these areas. They then passed this information on for colonization.
Armed with greater information, the age of exploration began the scramble for Africa. The continent was up for grabs. To divide the spoils, European nations convened at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where they sliced up the African continent into spheres of influence. Britain had formerly occupied Egypt 2 years earlier in 1882 to control the Suez Canal, the strategic route to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. In Berlin, it was decided the Nile Basin region would fall under British rule.
When the British took control of Egypt in 1882, they very soon realized that they had become rulers of a society that were totally dependent upon the Nile. So they understood from the very beginning that the economic development and political stability of Egypt depend upon Nile control.
To assert control upstream, the British established what it called the East Africa Protectorate in 1895, comprising what is today Kenya and Uganda. Their next step was Sudan, a territory ruled by Egypt since 1820. With their domination in Egypt, the British persuaded the Egyptians to sign an agreement in January 1899, allowing for joint rule over Sudan. In reality, joint rule was a fig leaf for British command. Here in the presidential palace in Khartoum, to this day, a museum houses portraits of former governors of Sudan. The paintings are testament to a time of British dominion.
The British mastered the art of ruling Sudan. They completely sidelined the Egyptians. The Governor-General was British, the commander of the army was British, and so were all the high-ranking officials in the administration.
Controlling the Great Lakes region, source of the White Nile, the British next turned their attention to ensuring hegemony over the Blue Nile, the river's other source originating in the Ethiopian highlands. In May 1902, the British signed an agreement with Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, in which he promised not to build any dam that might affect the flow of the Blue Nile to Egypt. Feeling they had secured the full length of the Nile, Britain's decision-makers in London began to put in place the next phase of their master plan, economic gain.
From quite early on, the British also decided to transform Egypt into a cotton farm for the textile industries of Lancashire in England.
British reliance on Egyptian cotton began to increase. To boost the harvest, the British set out to revolutionize Egypt's irrigation system, a system dating back thousands of years.
They gave priority to the water control issue, to the Nile control issue. They brought engineers, water planners from India, from the colonial service in India, to Egypt. Experienced guys. Gave them a lot of funds, a lot of political freedom, so that they really could take the Nile in hand.
The British came up with the idea for a dam in southern Egypt to hold back the Nile flood and use its waters for irrigation. Construction on the Aswan Low Dam began in 1899. It was officially opened 3 years later. At the time, it was the largest stone dam of its kind ever built. Britain wanted to ensure the full flow of the Nile reached Egypt to maximize cotton production. No one else upstream was allowed to siphon off any of the river.
Strict orders were laid down regarding the use of the Nile water because the British were concerned about Egypt. For example, they banned Sudanese farmers from using water pumps unless they obtained permission from the Egyptian Irrigation Authority.
Britain discriminated in favor of Egypt's claim over the Nile. The British expected the Egyptians to be thankful, but they were to have a rude awakening. In 1919, following the end of the First World War, the Egyptians revolted against British occupation and demanded complete independence. They were led by a fiery nationalist called Saad Zaghloul. With such sentiment on the rise, the British looked for a way to cower the Egyptians into submission. The River Nile, Egypt's lifeline, was an effective political weapon, and the British had in mind a perfect place to use this weapon. The Jazeera region in Sudan, between the Blue Nile and the White Nile, was an area with the potential to become the largest cotton-growing region in the world.
They had two plans, two motives, or two main strategic ideas behind the Jazeera scheme. Or one, to increase the cotton production in Sudan for the benefit of the British textile industry. Secondly, that, hey, listen, you, Egypt, is not really in control of the Nile. It's running through Sudan. And who has the power in Sudan? The British has the power in Sudan.
British attempts to intimidate the Egyptians only further inflamed nationalist sentiment. A crisis point was reached when, in November 1924, Sir Lee Stack, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Army and Governor of Sudan, was assassinated while driving through the streets of Cairo. The assassins were arrested and sentenced to death. But the murder of the British official was a turning point. London now found its reason to implement the Jazeera scheme.
What they did was that, okay, you killed the Governor General, then we will take more votes from the Nile as a punishment. So this was the first time, in practice, an upstream power punished the downstream power Egypt with a water weapon.
Britain's trump card was the Sennar Dam, completed in 1925. Built on the Blue Nile in Sudan, it would help the irrigation of the Jazeera area. But it also delivered an ominous signal to the Egyptians. For the first time in their history, a dam built outside of Egypt would affect the flow of the Nile into their country. Nationalists, however, continued to mobilize popular support against the British occupation. Cooler heads in London began to realize that relations with Egypt were deteriorating fast, something which could threaten British control over the Suez Canal. As before, the River Nile became a useful political tool, this time for compromise rather than coercion. In May 1929, notes were exchanged between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, George Lloyd, and the Egyptian Prime Minister, Mohammed Mahmoud Pasha. This diplomacy led to a landmark agreement in which Britain awarded Egypt exclusive control over the full course of the Nile waters.
From Egypt's point of view, the 1929 agreement was, of course, a victory, because here the British said that, well, the Nile is an Egyptian river, more or less, and Egypt has a veto right to stop projects upstream if they don't want it.
By signing the 1929 agreement, the British sought to co-opt the Egyptians. No such consideration was given to the indigenous peoples upstream who were not consulted, even though the river originated in their lands. By the early 1930s, Britain was becoming increasingly concerned with a growing menace closer to home. At the end of World War II in 1945, Britain was no longer the mighty empire that could claim control over large parts of the world, such as the Nile Basin.
After the Second World War, Britain came out of the war injured. British economy came out very much devastated. And the USA now became the world power.
The United States stepped forward to assert itself more boldly on the world stage in places formerly controlled by the old empires. In 1953, US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles became the first high-ranking American official to visit Cairo. Dulles offered financial support for the construction of a massive new dam on the Nile in southern Egypt. But 3 years later, the offer was withdrawn. The Americans had become suspicious of Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser's non-alignment policy. At the same time, the withdrawal of the offer provided an opportunity to undermine British influence.
John Foster Dulles and the American government, they understood quite clearly that one way of crushing the influence of the British imperialists in this area was to make them powerless when it comes to the Nile question. It became clear that to everybody that it was the Americans who decided, and the British had to just follow what they said.
Despite the withdrawal of financial support for the construction of the Aswan High Dam, Nasser chose to push ahead. In July 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal Company to provide funding for the project. The takeover stunned British and French shareholders in the Suez Company. The British, still ruling parts of East Africa, had a secret plan of retaliation. The plan would involve using the Owen Falls Dam in Uganda to cut off the flow of the Nile upstream in an attempt to force Nasser to give up the Suez Canal. The scheme was never adopted, since the ensuing drought would take too long to have its effect on Egypt. Britain wanted more immediate action, so they reverted to a more obvious method: boots on the ground. In 1956, Britain and France, with Israeli collusion, invaded Egypt in a bid to seize back the canal. The Americans publicly distanced themselves from the aggression.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
The United Nations declared a ceasefire. The Suez crisis ended with a humiliating withdrawal of the invasion forces from Egypt. It was to prove a seminal moment in modern history. The sun was setting on the British Empire. Colonialism was on the decline. In Africa, nations began to gain their independence, among them Nile upstream countries. The winds of change were blowing, creating new states and new demands for a share of the waters of the Nile. Khartoum, capital of Sudan. The meeting point of the White Nile from the Great Lakes region and the Blue Nile from the Ethiopian highlands. Hamdi is a resident of Tuti Island, where the two Niles converge. He explains to his son the difference in the color of the waters. The White Nile on the left and the Blue Nile on the right, and how they join here to form one river flowing northwards to Egypt.
The most beautiful thing distinguishing us from the rest of the world is the Nile. There is no other river like it. It's a great river, heavenly, and the life around it is unique.
In his small truck, each day Hamdi delivers vegetables across the river to the market of Omdurman.
I live of the Nile. I take vegetables that grow here to the market. How would I live otherwise? I never move away. Even when we die, we'll be buried by the Nile.
Sudan's road to independence started in the middle of the 20th century. In 1953, Britain and Egypt, joint rulers over Sudan for more than 50 years, signed an agreement giving the Sudanese people the right to self-determination. 2 years later, in 1955, the Sudanese parliament unanimously adopted a declaration of independence, rather than unifying with Egypt into a single country. On January the 1st, 1956, the Sudanese flag was raised for the first time in Khartoum. The largest country in Africa was born, a country forming 60% of the entire Nile basin area. Sudan had enormous agricultural potential, but there was a drawback. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian agreement allotted only 4 billion cubic meters of Nile waters to the Sudanese territory, compared to Egypt's 48 billion cubic meters. The newly independent Sudanese were not happy inheriting this colonial legacy.
This agreement reinforced Egyptian dominance over the Nile and gave Sudan just a token amount.
Most Sudanese believe that the Nile agreements were unjustly set and that distribution of the water should have been based on the size of the country. Sudan's share should have been much more than what was agreed upon because it's far larger.
The 1929 agreement had also given Egypt the right to monitor the Nile flow beyond Egyptian territory.
I remember when I was a young engineer. I moved to the Sennar Dam. My roommate was an Egyptian engineer, and his sole job was to check the amount of water Sudan took from the Nile and to ensure that Sudan didn't take water during the drought season.
Keen to assert its newly won sovereignty, the Sudanese government declared it was no longer bound by the 1929 agreement. By 1958, relations between Sudan and Egypt had deteriorated. Sudan's foreign minister traveled to Cairo for urgent meetings. The two peoples had often described themselves as brothers of the Nile Valley, but now there was a growing rift. But dramatic events in Khartoum brought a sudden end to tensions. In November 1958, the Sudanese army staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the government. General Ibrahim Aboud took the reins of power. Looking back on events, some see the hand of then Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser behind the coup.
Jamal Abdel Nasser liked military coups. And Lieutenant General Aboud was close to the Egyptian regime.
A year after the coup, a Sudanese delegation arrived in Cairo to sign a new Nile agreement. The 1959 full utilization of Nile waters agreement allocated a new share of the river ahead of the completion of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. Once constructed, the dam was due to save over 30 billion cubic meters of floodwater annually. Egypt's share of the Nile increased by several billion cubic meters. Sudan's limited share more than quadrupled. The 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan consolidated a renewed alliance.
Egypt and Sudan formed a joint committee responsible for monitoring the river in the two countries and increasing its water flow.
One way to increase the Nile waters was to resurrect a plan dating back to British colonial times. Over 20 billion cubic meters of the Nile waters carried downstream from the Great Lakes region are lost by evaporation in the huge swamp area of southern Sudan known as the Sud. The plan was to dig a canal diverting the Nile to bypass this area, reducing the water loss. It was called the Jonglei Canal. There was one problem. Sudan was far from stable. The nation had been born with a dangerous fault line between a predominantly Arab and Muslim north and a mainly Christian and animist south. Chief Damian is a village leader on the outskirts of Juba, the capital of southern Sudan. He remembers the mood of secession in the south during the early 1950s.
We wanted to partner because we were used always by Arabs as second men in the government. We were cheated. We were cheated by the Arabs, not as Arabs. We were cheated badly. I'm not an Arab. I'm an African by origin. I'm an African.
In August 1955, the first Sudanese civil war erupted between north and south. Fighting raged for 17 years. Eventually, a peace accord was signed in 1972 in Addis Ababa. The end of fighting meant that plans for the Jonglei Canal in southern Sudan could now be brought back off the shelf. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and his Sudanese counterpart Jafar el-Numeri did exactly this. And in 1978, work started on the 360-kilometer canal. But the southern Sudanese viewed the project with suspicion. The main tribes of the region, such as the Nuer and Dinka, made a living by grazing their cattle across the Sud. The Jonglei Canal threatened to dry up significant parts of this wetland. From the start, it proved harmful for the tribes and their livestock.
I know that when the Jonglei Canal was being opened, I was still a young man, and we saw stack and stack of cattle coming from the east, going to the Nile to drink water. And they just went in and they perished because of the big bank that was open because of those machines.
A campaign against the Jonglei Canal project gained momentum, reaching far and wide.
The Jonglei Canal was met with a hostile campaign. I was Minister of Irrigation, and I received letters from Japan, from environmentalists, asking me why we would want to dry the wetlands in southern Sudan and create a desert. A letter from someone in Japan who wasn't even living here and had no rights to this water? It was part of the campaign of negativity aimed at creating instability in our area. By the early 1980s, the project, almost two-thirds complete, had become the focus for suspicion
and wild rumors.
Well, there was politics, and you know politicians can create, they can create stories to frighten people. One of them was that probably there were a lot of Egyptians coming to settle on the canal. That was not true, but of course, in the absence of proper information, anything could be believed.
Relations between the North and the South began to deteriorate once again. In 1983, a group of southern Sudanese soldiers mutinied, refusing to obey orders from their northern commanders. An officer by the name of John Garang joined the mutineers. He led them into the bush to start a guerrilla movement which came to be known as the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA.
The Sudan's People Liberation Army was not against the Jonglei Canal project as such. John Garang, the leader of SPLA, had written his PhD thesis, by the way, on the Jonglei Canal. His problem was not the project itself, but his complaint was the southern Sudan also needs water, and we will not just be satisfied with a little bit.
The project provided one of the very first targets for the SPLA at the beginning of Sudan's second civil war between the North and the South. The canal's giant excavator lays in the spot where it dug its last hole, a rusting, destroyed wreck. The fighting lasted for 22 years. 2 million people died and 4 million became refugees. After a series of talks, a peace agreement ending the civil war was signed in January 2005 in Naivasha, Kenya. The accord stipulated a referendum to be held throughout southern Sudan on independence by January 2011. The referendum resulted in southern secession. A new country was born, and a new question arose. Would the new country abide by previous water agreements, allocating a share of the Nile flow? Even before the announcement of the referendum result, the opinion from the South was clear.
We must revise those agreements, because should Southern Sudan become a different state, then this must be revised, because Southern Sudan is no longer included in that agreement.
A new Nile Basin country in Africa rejecting the validity of old agreements. A new nation looking to secure its own share of the river's waters. Something similar has happened before. In the 1960s, with European colonial powers declining, a number of African nations gained their independence, among them upstream states on the River Nile. Soon after, they announced they would not abide by the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Nile Agreement, which had given Egypt exclusive control of the river.
Article 14D of 1929 agreement, it states very clearly that no states shall be able to utilize the Nile River waters, or the rivers feeding the Niles, or the lakes which feeds the River Nile, without the approval of the Egyptians, of the Egyptian government. That alone gives veto to Egypt over other riparian states.
The two agreements from the previous century, from 1929 and 1959, lie at the heart of today's struggle over the Nile. Egypt and Sudan on one side, see the agreements as historical legacies to be maintained.
We must uphold agreements and treaties. This is a logic that applies to national borders too. You can't just change the borders of African countries because their demarcation had been ratified in pre-independence treaties. And so, you can't just demand new stipulations in the Nile agreements, especially since this is a crucial case relating to our livelihood. The Nile waters are such a case. Egypt doesn't have any other water source.
On the other side, upstream countries see the past agreements as colonial relics and demand their own rights to a share of the Nile waters.
We are all aware that the agreement on the usage of the Nile water was signed way back during the colonial time. And since then, a lot of things have happened, and therefore there was need to review the agreement itself on how the countries through which the Nile goes can benefit equitably.
In an effort to resolve the growing dispute, in 1999, the ministers of water resources from all the Nile Basin countries met here in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The so-called Nile Basin Initiative was launched, aimed at promoting joint projects and reaching a new agreement over the sharing of the Nile. But the mood of camaraderie at the initial meetings soon changed.
I'd like it to be known that the relationship between us and them wasn't that amicable. They believed we were taking all of the water and that they were getting nothing. When we went for meetings in those countries, they would say, "You're taking our water." I don't want to say it was a hostile atmosphere, but it certainly wasn't friendly.
The upstream countries accused Egypt of digging in its heels by refusing to consider relinquishing the agreements from the previous century. Negotiations continued over 10 years. Attitudes hardened, positions became ever more entrenched. The Egyptians saw their share of the river flow as both negligible and non-negotiable.
The amount of rainfall in the entire Nile Basin area is 1.6 trillion cubic meters. But what arrives downstream is 84 billion cubic meters only, which means less than 5%. So where does the difference go? It's wasted in evaporation, in swamps, in forests, and it is not used in upstream countries. Therefore, we should put aside this small quantity, which is less than 5%, leave it aside, and focus on building joint projects between the Nile Basin countries. This will save part of the lost water. Then we can divide it in a fair way between the 10 basin countries.
The upstream countries rejected Egyptian arguments. Ethiopia was one of the countries which, after years of being caught up in internal strife and tragedy, was now pushing more forcefully for a greater share of the Nile.
Rainfall is not entitled here to be negotiated because this is based on the nature, and it is a green water, and green water is not negotiated in any international agreement. That's why Ethiopia is demanding the Nile water as well. All waters within its territory is its natural resources, and that natural resource is the resource of every Ethiopian people.
Things reached a head in May 2010 at a meeting in Entebbe, Uganda, when 4 upstream nations signed a new agreement, nullifying older ones and setting out policies for a more equitable share of the Nile. To this date, 6 countries are signatories: Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi. Egypt and Sudan were absent, having refused to even attend the meeting. There was a mood of celebration among those who signed the so-called Nile Cooperative Framework Agreement.
I want to congratulate ourselves as countries of the Riparian for having come this far. I know some of us are not there, but it requires even more concerted effort to make sure that we are all on board.
The signatories believe Egypt and Sudan will have to come on board at some point and sign the new agreement.
All the time they walk out, but they still come back because there is no any other source that they can be able to use. And what we have been telling them, the only simple way is cooperation.
With constructive recommendations. Sure enough, a few weeks later, in June 2010, the Egyptians returned to the negotiating table. It was a bitter pill for them to swallow. However, they have yet to sign the Entebbe Agreement. For the Egyptians, at least for the time being, facts on the ground are more important than the signing of any accord.
Egypt and certain neutral parties believe that we don't need to sign any agreement at the present time, that there is no need for a framework agreement for the foreseeable future. We believe what is important is what is happening on the ground, especially the fact that there are no big dam projects at the present time that may affect Egyptian interests.
But the status quo is unlikely to hold. African upstream nations are increasingly demanding a larger share of the Nile waters. Such demands are raising fears downstream. Fears stoked up by a history of suspicion and rivalry. Fears about countries not only on the Nile, but even beyond the great river itself.